the more people who raise their voices and say, I'm concerned about climate change, it's a priority for me, it's a top issue. And the more people who say, in fact, it's so important that I'm willing to make some sacrifices, or I'd like to see society change in some ways in order to embrace a new energy economy, really. The more people who do that, then I think we'll see our elected officials respond to that and enact policies that that reflect those values. I mean, I think fundamentally, Washington and in my state, Springfield, I think politicians don't want to get too far ahead of their constituents. And so if the constituents are raising their voices and saying, we value this and this is a priority to us, and I think we'll see the response that's necessary.
Welcome to the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In this podcast, students and early career researchers share more about their publication in the journal. Join us weekly to hear from the next generation of STEM leaders as we elevate their voices in science, technology, and innovation policy. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this episode of SciPol SoundBites, a podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm Adriana Bankston, JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer and your host for this podcast. Today, we continue with episodes from the joint issue between JSPG and the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowships Program. Authors we're interviewing today are discussing important topics around climate change, environmental issues, agriculture, and more. So let's talk a little bit about each publication. So we'll start with Ingrid Paredes. Ingrid is a fifth-year PhD candidate in chemical engineering at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. She studies the synthesis and optoelectronics properties of semiconducting nanomaterials. She's also the president and co-chair of March for Science New York City, and she's passionate about science education and policy. The publication in JSPG by Ingrid and her co-authors is entitled Standardizing Climate Education in New York State. So Ingrid, can you tell us a little more about your publication?
Sure. Thanks, Adriana, for having me to talk about the publication that me and my colleagues submitted to JSPG. This topic actually came to us from a youth activist that March for Science New York City was working with for some time, named Cynthia Leung, who's affiliated with Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion Youth. So these groups that are very much involved with direct action, particularly in New York City. Some of you might be familiar with the climate strikes that were ongoing before COVID, where these students were skipping school every Friday, essentially to communicate to decision makers, to their teachers, to adults that without rapid climate action, that there is just no need for them to go to school because they didn't feel that they had a future. And what Cynthia was finding was that as a student who's actually passionate about pursuing STEM herself, that she didn't feel that the passion that the youth activist was having was matching to the quality of climate education and science education that they were getting in their schools. So she actually reached out to Senator Andrew Paredes, who sponsored one of the bills that we evaluated, to see what could be done. And what they did was draft this bill about creating this model curriculum, and they wanted feedback from organizers like myself, Omar, and Steve, as well as teachers at her school. She goes to Brooklyn Technical High School, which is not too far from where I'm calling you, actually, and to see what we thought and what other bills were out there. So that led us to do a bit of a lit review on what else was going on in New York State Senate. And aside from the model curriculum bill, which essentially is a remake of not just science education, but really inputting environmental justice issues into the curriculum all across the board. So for example, what is the social impact of climate change? How can we talk about climate change in our math courses? How can we integrate issues of climate change more, and maybe holistically is the word, into the curriculum and the conversations that we're having in school? And then there was taking it from a more administrative or standardized testing standpoint. So if we establish a curriculum, then what is the metric for student success? And then lastly, of course, what it comes down to in the end is how do we support these programs? How do they get funded, and what mechanisms are there? So the last bill that we evaluated was a climate grant program, actually modeled by a bill that passed in Washington State a few years ago that established a Climb Time program. It is basically an experiential learning experience where students can go to community partners, do citizen science projects and learn about climate that way. So what we did in our work was look at the 3 of them, look at their effectiveness, and see which in the end would be the best fit for students.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, that's really interesting and important. As I was listening to you, I was thinking that there's probably a lot of people who are interested in environmental justice and climate change, and students who might want to get involved. Can you explain a little more about how we might be able to educate people on these topics, and what specifics or certain programs that you're thinking of or other ways to do that?
Sure, definitely. I'm going to quote a climate scientist, Professor Catherine Hayhoe, on this one, that the best thing to do to fight climate change is to talk about it. And school is one method of doing that. Of course, like having a standardized education around this all across the state is one way, but also just people's lived experiences, which I think is where Cynthia and even myself growing up in New York City and in Jersey around these issues really started to get interested in issues of climate, that the environment is, it's not just like us and then the environment. We are a part of the environment, we live in the environment, and having those conversations to start with, even with friends and family, is important. And then the second thing is to putting like my scientist grad student hat on, is to do the literature review, do a deep dive on what that is. And that comes from different sources. Like I think one of the things I've learned working in science policy is like, I'm not an education policy expert, right? I'm a grad student in chemical engineering, but by speaking with educators, by speaking with youth who are in the schools right now, by speaking with scientists who are working in education, I can get a feel for where the needs are and like what the gap is. So I think it's about bridging that community with like academic knowledge to draw your conclusions and where you want to get involved.
Great, that's a great answer. Thank you, very helpful. Okay, so let's move on to Tim. Tim Steeves recently received his PhD from University of Chicago's Molecular Engineering program. His interest in environmental policy and sustainable energy productions led him to science policy as a career interest, and to found the U Chicago Science Policy Group. He is currently a senior policy fellow at Carbon 180, an environmental NGO that advocates for carbon removal solutions in policy, business, and research. Publication in JSPG by Timothy and co-authors is entitled Establishing Climate Change Resilience in the Great Lakes in Response to Flooding. So we'll continue talking about climate change. Tim, can you talk a little bit about your publication?
Yeah, absolutely. So our memo that we put together was originally for the JSPG Memo Contest. So we were working as part of 2 teams for our science policy group at U Chicago. And we came up with this idea kind of as part of a group discussion, talking about things that were relevant to the Chicago area. We had done this big event recently talking about Chicago water quality and kind of water systems. And we're thinking more about, the larger water system of the Great Lakes Basin. And we really wanted to dig into something that was like kind of relevant to right now, which was, and I think climate change absolutely still is. So this memo ended up really kind of going over, we learned a lot about how both the local, state, provincial governments manage the area around the Great Lakes on both the Canadian and the United States sides, and then also how they work to do different things like cleaning it up and, improving combined sewage overflows, and then also what can be done that can make it a lot better. So, we have this increased precipitation, like have both increased precipitation overall on an annual basis, but also the increase of these really heavy precipitation events where you get like an insane amount of rainwater over the course of a few days, which can cause like huge flooding. And then really, like, you think about a couple of years ago in Houston, they had that massive rainfall. And it flooded all those chemical sites, both those industrial waste sites. And that means that you suddenly have all of this, waste that was confined to a Superfund site is now in the watershed. And so we're thinking about kind of preventative work in that sense. And then also work that can be done on what you call combined sewage overflows, which are in urban centers, or if you can build up green infrastructure so that basically you don't get erosion from these heavy rain events. So we came up with a lot of really interesting recommendations, and we learned a ton ourselves about the governments and what's already been going on there. So it's a really great experience as well for us. Happy to talk more about any of it, but that's the basic idea.
Great, that's really interesting. I think so. Both you and Ingrid talked about kind of local effects and around where you live and what's going on there, and how that might be addressed. So I'm wondering if you think that your local government should address this, or is this something that can be expanded into other areas? Because I can imagine that this might also be a case in other parts of the country. So how do you see this being addressed locally at the state and federal level?
Absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And I think it's something we thought about a lot and struggled with. And I think it's one of the kind of those big governance questions in general is like, do you want decisions to be made locally or federally? Who decides what money is being spent on? And I think of course, the boring, but I think reasonable answer is that it probably depends. And it really works best when everybody's involved and giving their input and being listened to. And I think definitely the local governments and the local, state and city governments often have the best idea of what they need right in that moment. And making sure that they see those as priorities is really important, and make sure that they have the funding to do all of that stuff. And then, when you're talking about these larger cooperative efforts, it's tough to put even Chicago, a massive city, you can't put the cleanliness of Lake Michigan on Chicago, because there's, a ton of cities that all live right by it and have their sewage systems hooked up and have their chemical waste hooked up. And so you really need to be working with everybody. So this, I think there's a lot of coordination work that can be done at the federal and even the international level, where you have these binational agreements between Canada and the United States. And so the answer is I think there's room for everybody. There's these really great interstate compact stuff that actually has been already, the states work together already to help manage the lakes. I think it's called the Great Lakes Interagency Task Force, if I'm remembering exactly correctly. But it's something that you can really build this collaboration on, because everybody wants the Great Lakes to be doing well, because there's this huge, it's where they all live, and it's this big, wonderful natural resource that everybody relies on.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's a complex issue. And I also like that you brought up the idea of community. I think that's something that Ingrid brought up as well, that this is something that extends beyond the university or where you're working on this into affecting a lot of different people and stakeholders. So very important, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to Ryan. Ryan Himes is a professor of biological sciences at Olivet Nazarene University in Bourbonnais, Illinois, where his research focuses on policy surrounding environmental sustainability. He earned his PhD in human physiology from Loyola University Chicago. And the publication in JSPG by Ryan and co-authors is entitled Financial and Environmental Cost-Benefit Analyses Support the Continuation of Government Incentives for Solar Power. So Ryan, this topic is really critical and timely. Can you tell us a little more about the issues that your publication addressed?
Sure. So obviously the main issue that we're talking about here is climate change, and the science is clear that we need to transition to renewable energy in order to curb the effects of climate change. So my publication kind of looks at, well, what are the barriers to society doing that, and how might we incentivize entities, individuals, or organizations to make the transition to renewable energy technology. So at my university, students and faculty alike were looking at ways for how we could be more sustainable as a campus on a limited budget, though. So we looked into wind power and solar power, and our administration said we would like to embrace this transition. However, we don't really have the funds. We don't have the upfront capital, at least, to install a large solar array or a wind turbine. And so I and a few others kind of looked into different resources that might be available, different funding opportunities. And we discovered that even for a nonprofit organization such as ours, there are incentive dollars available to help make this transition. But there are a lot of factors that came into play there in order to see if it was, how viable this was, and when the payoff period would be. In other words, at what point does your investment start to actually save you money? And one thing that we found through our analysis is that those government incentive programs really make a big difference in terms of pushing up the payoff period. So, I would argue that even if it was a long payoff period, it's still worth it, because climate change is such a critical issue, and we need to be really doing everything we can in order to prevent increased global mean temperatures. But the reality is that a lot of organizations won't be able to make that transition unless there's some help. And so we found that the government incentive help basically really needs to continue or increase in order to get our state of Illinois and the nation to 100% renewable energy sooner rather than later.
Yeah, really important. I think, again, a common theme here is the need for funding for some of these issues, as well as local impacts. So I think the same question for you is, how can this be addressed on a larger scale than just your community?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, when I think about our nation as a whole, really in the globe, the more people who raise their voices and say, I'm concerned about climate change, it's a priority for me, it's a top issue, and the more people who say, in fact, it's so important that I'm willing to make some sacrifices, or I'd like to see society change in some ways in order to embrace a new energy economy, really. The more people who do that, then I think we'll see our elected officials respond to that and enact policies that that reflect those values. I think fundamentally, Washington and in my state Springfield, I think politicians don't want to get too far ahead of their constituents. And so if the constituents are raising their voices and saying, we value this and this is a priority to us, and I think we'll see the response that's necessary. On the other hand, if too many people say, maybe I don't really believe that climate change is a threat, or I don't think it's an urgent threat, or what I hear a lot is, okay, it's a threat, but we need to protect current jobs that are in place and current industries. We need to prioritize those things above and beyond addressing climate change. Then change is going to come too slowly or not at all. So fundamentally, I guess my answer is pretty simple, but I think kind of going to like what Ingrid was talking about, if we educate persons and get more people to be aware of the realities and then to raise their voices and say, hey, this is a priority for me and an issue that's important, then I think change will come swifter.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's an interesting time to be talking about climate change now with the changing administration too. So yeah. I'm curious to see what will happen. But I think since you mentioned Ingrid's work as well, do you think that this is a legislative fix? You think something bills on these topics would be helpful, or do you see other solutions?
Yeah, both. Legislatively, these incentive programs need to be reauthorized or even upped and increased. And so that can change some of the economics that would drive an institution such as mine, to embrace solar power, which we are doing. We can talk about that later. But yeah, also fundamentally at a grassroots level, also education and community leaders. There's a lot that we can do sort of outside of the legislative arena as well, just raising awareness and educating and raising voices on this.
Yes, definitely, I agree. And nice to see this common themes as well. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so we'll move on to Chris. Chris Jackson is a fourth-year chemistry PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, where his research focuses on the development of nanomaterial tools for biomolecular delivery and sensing. He currently serves as the workshop's director for engineering and science acting locally, as president of the science policy group at Berkeley, and has been an editor for JSPG. He is passionate about science policy and advocacy related to energy, climate, immigration, and equity. The publication in JSPG by Chris and his co-authors is entitled Streamlined USDA Regulation of Gene Editing to Benefit US Agriculture. So I think this topic of agriculture is also really timely. Chris, tell us more about your work.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Adriana. Yeah, I think it fits really well in with some of the themes that other folks have raised so far, in that agriculture and more broadly food production in the United States is a huge part of how we're going to tackle the growing climate crisis. I think, and especially coming at it from a scientific perspective, one of the things that we'll need in order to grow the estimated 70% more food that the planet will need by 2050 is the use of advanced science and engineering techniques, including gene editing techniques like CRISPR-Cas9 that can be used to select for maybe more desirable plant traits or to produce crops more efficiently in resource-constrained areas. And so coming at this now from a science policy lens, really the US federal policy to kind of regulate these genetically engineered crops has not kept up to date with the latest science. And it's at this time a patchwork of various agencies, laws, and regulatory decisions that kind of regulate this space. Primarily at the federal level, we see this through a mix of three different agencies. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and then the US Department of Agriculture. And so broadly, each of these departments regulates a different aspect of genetic engineering in crops depending on its use, whether it's for pesticide regulation, more around food and safety, or then potential risk of agricultural plant health. So each of these departments manages a different one, which again makes it complicated. So in turn, that takes a lot of both time and money to move a crop from maybe the lab bench to market. And as a result of this process really favors large established companies. We see that the vast majority of genetically engineered crops are produced by only a very small fraction of the players in this space. And it makes it very difficult for new firms and especially academic researchers who are interested in entering this market. And also for specialty crops outside of maybe the more traditional large-scale agricultural cash crops. So more specialty crops like grapes and almonds have a much more difficult time entering markets as well. So given we're at a point, I think, when genetic engineering, obviously, there was just the Nobel Prize this year was awarded for CRISPR-Cas9. We're at a time when genetic engineering and the need for a lot of these tools are really intersecting, and I think our policy really needs to keep up with that. So my co-authors and I in our policy memo really tried to address this when we recommended two actions. First, there are existing protocols, including a proposed web-based platform where GMO producers can kind of find more information and submit product approval applications. So under kind of the existing regulation that currently exists, the USDA is the organization tasked with creating such a platform, but really the current version, especially as proposed, is insufficient. It only provides basic descriptions of the different regulatory roles of the USDA, FDA, and EPA, kind of how I've just outlined. So instead, in our memo, we proposed that this should also be an avenue to really submit applications for commercial approval. So this unified web platform should then ideally be a tool that can especially help these small and medium-sized producers who really don't have the legal expertise or the resources to go through a convoluted and complicated process approval. So that was our first recommendation. And then the second one, really, we recommend that the USDA create an office to consolidate all of this communication between crop developers and manage a clearinghouse for inquiries. So rather than developers having to figure out, am I supposed to submit to the FDA or the EPA, the USDA, where am I supposed to go? And then, submitting an application and hearing back months later that, this is the wrong place. We really recommended kind of a clearinghouse where, based on the current existing protocols, the USDA probably has the best jurisdiction to manage this process. We recommended that they mandate, a publicly accessible database that kind of contains the results of all different completed regulatory status reviews and coordinate their responses to manage communication and maintain this consolidated online platform. And these are actions that the executive branch and these agencies can take on their own. There may also be additional need for the US Congress to appropriate some funds to support these efforts. But overall, we believe that these proposals should really expand access and allow more people to enter this critically needed space.
Great, that's very interesting. Thank you. And it's interesting you're bringing up again the idea of education, which seems to be a common theme, and also the agencies, which hasn't come up before, but is a big part of the regulating some of these issues as well. So one question for you is, so you mentioned the USDA. Do you think that how should the USDA act, or do you think that this is kind of a multi-agency action? Should the agencies work together, or should the USDA sort of lead? How do you see this being implemented?
I think there's definitely a need for cooperation, absolutely, and this will require during this transitionary period and as a new administration steps in, I think there's a lot of opportunities for cooperation and kind of understanding where these different agencies fit in. I think there's definitely still a role and different expertises within these agencies that can facilitate this, but there really needs to be someone taking the lead and kind of showcasing that. So we recommended, kind of based on existing structures, that the USDA would be the best one to manage it, but we did not specifically, we considered this, we specifically did not recommend that the USDA take on all of these regulatory decisions by itself, and rather serve as a clearinghouse to kind of better manage the inquiry process so that from a producer side, it's much more streamlined and straightforward, but there's still the needed level of scrutiny and regulation that can take place on the agency side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm gonna move on to William, so we'll come back to that. So William Otta is a third-year PhD student in the Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology department at UC Riverside. He studies the effects of cities on the formation and maintenance of freshwater communities using field manipulations and biological surveys. He currently serves as the Government Relations Chair of UC Riverside Science Policy and is the instructor for the National Science Policy Network SciPol Scholars Boot Camp. William wants to pair his scientific and policy work to address the compounding ecological crises occurring in mixed human-woodland systems that are growing more common in the 21st century. The publication in JSPG by William and co-authors is entitled Environmental DNA Monitoring, Better Tracking of Endangered Rare, Cryptic, and Invasive Species. So William, can you explain more about what your publication entails?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. So when we talk about environmental DNA monitoring, what we're actually doing is taking samples of air, water, or soil, and then running it through a PCR machine like what is used to test for COVID-19 currently, and we can see then what species are present in that local area. So one of the big things that eDNA does is let us sample and survey for rare, so species that have few numbers, cryptic, species that are hard to detect, invasive, species that are causing ecological damage, or endangered, species that are often both cryptic and rare and just difficult to find in the first place, much more easily than traditional biological survey methods can do. So when I worked for United States Geological Surveys as a biological science technician, I would go out and I would literally sit in a stream and crawl my way up through like 10 inches of water in Southern California with a mask on, trying to count the number of frogs, newts, crayfish, and other things that were in the water. And this takes hours and hours, and you can only sample very small sections of streams and rivers. So I work a lot in water. Then you extrapolate out that data to a much larger area to try and estimate the number of species based on presence and absence and all these other metrics that we collect in our surveys. eDNA, because of how the shedded DNA is transported through aquatic systems primarily is where we collect it from at the moment, we can actually survey broader areas in some cases than we can with traditional methods. And it's also much faster to collect the DNA samples from a wide variety of habitats. So eDNA, when used appropriately, and there's a lot of caveats to using it appropriately, but it can increase the amount of data we have on the presence and absence of these important categories of species. So if we think about the development of cities, developing new lands, conserving existing lands, and protecting species that are endangered or preventing the spread of invasive species, knowing where and when these species are present is really important for the scientific and policy community. So we hope that by really looking into the history of eDNA, its current uses, and specifically when it is most appropriate to be used, this policy memo can give guidance to agencies and policymakers who want to expand our ability to make informed environmental and conservation decisions that need biological monitoring data. So we proposed a couple of mechanisms for this monitoring practice to be expanded in California and set it up for long-term success. So eDNA has been used before in California to sort of pilot and test in a variety of ways, but because of the cost and then the difficulty in like setting up this initial system, it needs a sort of large upfront investment. But if we're able to get that, we're well prepared to succeed in the future as the number of endangered species increase, the number of invasive species increase, and the cost of all this biological monitoring goes up. So we really want to highlight both the difficulties in properly implementing eDNA, why it is so useful to the policy and scientific community, and why we should be investing now in this before we get to the point where we can't properly fund or answer all of the distribution and species abundance questions that we do have, and that we're going to have more of in the future.
It's very comprehensive, thank you. Yeah, so you already sort of answered the implementation question. I'm thinking more basic about people who would like to work on this. What kind of species would you start with? Because I'm not familiar with how you do this work, and what would be the most impactful kind of research to do?
Yeah, I think some of the best places to start are actually with invasive species, and specifically those that are facilitated by human movement between habitats. A great example of this are New Zealand mud snails and then also zebra mussels. Both of these are species that are in a lot of recreational water bodies, places where people hike, fish, boat, and swim. And depending on how you use these water bodies, they can be transported on your boots, on your clothes, in containers taken from one water body to another. And if we use eDNA, we can quickly just check areas where we know there's high foot traffic between them, or like there's a lot of human traffic in the first place. And then we can get ahead of biological invasion. This is often the only chance we have to mechanically or physically remove these small, fast reproducing invasive species before they can establish themselves. So eDNA would let us quickly scan common places where humans recreate in water bodies, and then target removal efforts before it becomes too costly or really impossible to mechanically remove these invasive species. Because without the knowledge that something is present, we can't act and preserve the habitat for the historic species that live there. So that's like a pretty clear example, is a way that we actually currently use eDNA in some systems.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, and I think this seems like your research could have really widespread implications too. So it can be specific to certain communities or areas where there's more species. So, and you also mentioned kind of more financial support for some of this research. So can you comment a little bit on this idea of implementing locally versus federal? How do you think this can be addressed? Is it just federal support, or are there also other solutions?
Yeah, so this actually works great with the system we currently have. So at the federal level, there's actually the Aquatic eDNA Atlas run by the U.S. Forest Service, and they will loan equipment to local scientists or agencies to do eDNA surveys, and then that sample is sent back and processed both at the local level, and then a archival sample is sent to the eDNA Atlas program. That way others can use the sample as well. So this can be a way to pair like maybe the main infrastructure at a federal level or within a larger agency that's funded to store, hold a lot of equipment, and then also like repair and run maybe some of the eDNA libraries, whereas the actual collection and monitoring could be done by state and local agencies. So that way we're able to distribute responsibility to the people who either know the local community best versus those who can sort of centralize the infrastructure and running of an eDNA monitoring program. And it actually is a great way to get community scientists engaged in scientific research, because anyone can go out and collect a water sample depending on the eDNA technique you're using. So there's currently efforts to look at bacteria and microbes using eDNA in soil samples, but also scientists have looked at newt populations in the UK using community science efforts to collect water samples. So there's great ways where scientists can reach out and engage local community scientists, as well as using the actual scientific community and researchers to expand our eDNA monitoring programs.
Right. Yeah, I really like this idea of community engagement as well, which has come up in several of your publications here. So one of the things, so it seems like that also would increase access to this type of research. And going back to something that Chris mentioned about the platform that you have, and do you thinking more about how different populations are affected by this, or what access they have to the technology you're developing? How do underrepresented minorities fit into some of the work? Maybe we can start with Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think it can be maybe not as intuitive when you're thinking about, we're talking about the regulation, federal regulation of gene editing, and how does that really play in with people, and how does that play in? But it actually has a significant role. The USDA has a long history of supporting, or maybe in other cases not supporting, and exacerbating even racial disparities in the American agriculture since its inception, really. The USDA has restricted access to resources such as farm ownership loans to Black, Native American, Hispanic, and female farmers, the data has shown. And so it's kind of long overdue that we really take this lens on who are policies benefiting, even when we're talking about maybe less intuitive and maybe less exciting regulatory policies and federal agencies. So I really think is when we can kind of expand access in any way we can lower barriers, particularly regulatory barriers, that allow more small businesses, small stakeholder farms to kind of gain access to what is really becoming more and more a necessity in gene-edited agriculture. When we can expand the participants who, that really just lends itself to a much more equitable landscape in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that answer. So I want to ask Ingrid the same question. So when you think about federal policymaking, and how do you make good policy that will take this into account, especially with your lens of education? How do we educate these populations that they have less access to these resources?
Yeah, I think to like what Chris said, unfortunately, like a lot of things in this country, the education system in our country is deeply like inequitable to begin with. And with the climate crisis, this is an issue that disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities, right? And we've already seen the effects of this just this year with the disproportionate effect that COVID has had due to environmental racism. And that's really where our work wanted to play into. Sorry, I got a little bit snagged on my shoulder there. So where our work comes in is I should walk it back a second. Something that surprised me in our research is just the sheer differences in science education that exist. It's the unfortunate truth that, like in this country, on a broader spectrum, that the education that you get depends largely on the zip code that you live in. And in some cases in New York City, students don't even have science classes, or might not have the same quality science classes that their peers do. And what we found is that, like issues or like solutions that might, provide standardized testing or provide supplementary grants for student programming doesn't really get to the core of the issue, which is that this is like a scientific literacy issue that needs to be embedded into all of the education all across, because this is an issue that affects Black and brown communities the most.
Great. Yeah, thank you for addressing that. That's really important. To sort of ask this similarly to Ryan, so you're talking about solar power, renewable energy. So this, I could see this also being a question of access, that this is something that could really impact the environment, but not everyone has access to it, and financial resources. So again, same question for you. How do we reach people that may not have the funds to address this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we know, like Ingrid was saying, climate change is going to impact the most vulnerable among us in larger ways. And the federal government, I believe, is at the federal level, they've designated certain communities as environmental justice communities. So these are areas that have been especially hit by pollution or like water contamination, for example. So I know at least in Illinois, some of the funding for solar power, there's actually more opportunities for those environmental justice communities to access some of those incentive funds for solar power. So that's a good positive thing, I think. Trying to put those dollars in the most vulnerable communities, and that may also be true in other states as well. But I know at least in Illinois, there have been efforts to make sure that these funds are equitably accessed, and with particular emphasis on those environmental justice communities. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we addressed this issue. So pivoting a little bit to our viewers who might be interested in publishing in the journal and getting involved in some of these issues, which clearly are very critical and timely. I'm going to ask a couple of you to comment on how can we empower and incentivize grad students and early career researchers to get involved in these issues. So maybe we can have Tim respond.
Absolutely. As I don't know if I alluded to this earlier, but we have a kind of a fledgling. I guess maybe it's in its third year now. Science policy group at University of Chicago that I worked to get started back when I was there. And one of the things that we've done every single year since we started is the National Science Policy Network Memo Contest for in collaboration with JSPG. And that's just been a really interesting practice because it gives us all a chance to do some writing that's very much outside of our wheelhouse. People might have some expertise to a certain extent with what they're talking about, but nobody who's just doing a science degree comes in with enough information to know how to effectively write a memo right away. So you're really learning by doing, and you get a lot of chances to read other people's memos, and JSPG is full of these really amazing memos written by people like the other people in this podcast right now. It's like this great resource for learning about all this different stuff. And so we went through the process of submitting our memo for the contest, and we didn't win. And that first draft of that memo was, in my opinion, like now that we've edited a bunch, it's so much better now. So we were asked to resubmit it. We reworked it, went through another few rounds of editing, and honestly, it's one of the things I'm really, really proud of. And I think it's really, really helped me in my transition out from my PhD into a science policy fellowship position, because it's let me get a chance to do that sort of writing and do that sort of collaboration.
That's really nice to hear. Thank you for that feedback. And William, same question for you. So since you're so involved in the science policy space, do you have advice for early career researchers who want to get involved and study some of these topics?
Yeah, I definitely have some advice. So like you said, I've been involved for a few years now, and I actually started with the UC Riverside Science to Policy organization my first year in my PhD program. And that really gave me a chance to learn and grow both as a researcher through my PhD work, and then also in the science policy space as NSPN started to grow, which is the National Science Policy Network. And I think some of the best ways to just get started is to sign up for NSPN, listen to SciPol SoundBites or other science policy podcasts. The CASP organization at University of Wisconsin-Madison puts out their own podcast as well that's amazing on science policy. And there's some AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow podcasts as well. So check those out, see what really appeals to you, and then I would really encourage you sign up for the NSPN Slack channel and then talk to people. There's a lot of great places where you can just ask general questions. There's events that we post on there. And then also see if you have your own local university NSPN chapter or start your own NSPN chapter, because there's a lot of resources that we can provide you with now in this organization that has members like Chris, myself, Adriana, I think Tim, you're an NSPN member as well, who have gone through the process of learning what it means to be in science policy, how to write these policy memos, and then what you can do with it in your future career. And I think that's where there's actually a lot to grow, and why it's beneficial to PhD graduates is, you know, as everyone knows, there's a lack of tenure track professorships nowadays. So science policy really gives you a space where you can apply some of those research and analytical skills you have in a new way that, at least for me, I find really exciting, and I hope others do as well. So feel free to reach out to me, and I think Adriana will talk about like Twitter handles and things, but reach out to someone, join NSPN, listen to podcasts, and just hopefully you can find something that really excites you, because science policy is for every single topic in the world. There's nothing that policymakers don't really work on. So just try something and see what happens.
Very helpful. Yeah, I totally agree. So as we're wrapping up here, I want to give the other speakers a chance to talk a little bit about their experience publishing in JSPG, and if you have other just any final words for our early career listeners. Ingrid?
Sure. To piggyback off what Will was saying, my experience publishing the JSPG has been really formative, I think, in my career. So coming into science policy first as an organizer, working with like a lot of direct action groups like Sunrise, and then trying to fit in my skills as an academic scientist, this was like a perfect combination of those two, like I had mentioned before, right? The skills that we have as scientists, like doing literature reviews, proposing ideas, evaluating those ideas, and then putting it up to your peers to really evaluate and see, is something that we do daily, like in our lab lives, right? And we can use the same skills with policy. And the community that National Science Policy Network, that JSPG has created to do so openly without, again, having to be a subject matter expertise, but someone who's willing to learn and to listen, has been really, really great, frankly, and a really good experience for anyone who's interested in exploring science policy.
Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Having had the privilege to serve on both the editorial board for JSPG and now publish with JSPG, I've learned immensely both times from authors, from editors. So I think it's a really great way. And a common thing that I hear when I'm encouraging folks to get involved in science policy, and there's this hesitancy, oh, I don't know how to write a science policy memo. I'm not quite sure what I want to write about. And I think the best way to learn how to do it is just to do it. And JSPG is a great platform that will help you learn along the way in doing that. And again, like, if you look at the author list for this publication that I'm on, it includes chemists, it includes physicists, it includes biologists. And this is really an opportunity, especially at the early career stage level, where folks can come together across disciplines to kind of tackle an issue that we all have a common interest in, but maybe not that subject matter expertise, and really kind of learn how to translate some of those scientific skills into really creating a policy recommendation that you can be proud of and maybe have some impact with. So I highly recommend, if you're on the fence, just get started, find folks around you, whether it's through MSPN or your local universities, and just give it a shot.
Great, definitely. Yeah, and we're hoping that this podcast will help with that as well, because clearly you all are really talented and have worked a lot for this publication, but also you can learn from each other by being on here and discussing this. So hopefully we'll be able to create a community out of this. And then lastly, Ryan, if you'd like to comment on if you have advice.
Yeah, I think my general piece of advice is just that, I think there's a lot of scientists who want to do more to address major societal challenges, things that have to do with policy. But we're all so busy, right? We're busy in our labs, we're busy researching. And so for me, one of the keys was just trying to figure out how sort of to kill two birds with one stone. Like, I started thinking of activism and policy less of as an add-on to my already busy schedule, and trying to make it more like the focus of my work. So when I think about things that I want to research, I try to think about the societal issues that I'm passionate about and then try to sort of marry those together so that, as I'm doing research, it also naturally flows into to policy and changes for society or the opportunity to impact society. And so then, here at Olivet, where we were looking at how can we be more sustainable, and we started looking at solar panels, that required doing a lot of research just to figure out, how to take those steps. And so then my team and I thought, okay, we should write this up and submit it to JSPG, and that process was really smooth and efficient. We had some great help from our editors, and I felt like it was a really friendly publication, a friendly journal to publish with. So. And really, Adriana, I met you, at the NSPN conference a year ago, and you encouraged me to, hey, think about applying to this and or submitting to JSPG, and so that was encouraging as well. Got me going on that.
Great, happy to help, and glad to see you in this position and getting more involved. So great, thanks all of you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers today. You can find this episode and others like it on JSPG's YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. And that's it for this week on SciPol SoundBites, the podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal.